Hello to all of you joining this webinar. I'll give you a few more moments, please, to join. We look forward to having you with us. So let's kick off this socialprotection.org webinar. And hello to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And welcome, as I said, to this webinar. Today's talk is about what we really know about public works program impacts on assets for livelihoods and resilience. I'm your moderator today. My name is Eva Lüdi. I'm based in Bern, Switzerland, working for the Wyss Academy for Nature, with a background much more in the natural resource management field and not so much on the public works. For that, we have a panel of 4 experts who you can ask any question about natural resource management assets created through public works programs. I might chip in on some of the natural resource management aspects of those. But moving on from there, before introducing today's speakers and the session, I would like to quickly hand over to Anna McCord to briefly tell you more about the series of webinars to which today's belong. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Eva. Yes, I just wanted to mention that this webinar is the second webinar in a series, Public Works in a Changing Geopolitical and Climate Context, Lessons for the Future. And it's a series that's looking at critical contemporary issues in public works programming, drawing on 3 recent publications. And the series is running from April to June. And each webinar is based on the findings of a new piece of research, which really critically examines some of the issues that are facing those of us working in the public works sector. Next slide, please. The prior webinar was held on the 17th of April, and at that one we looked at an ILO paper that explored the tensions between employment creation and social protection objectives, and talked about the need to identify those kind of trade-offs and manage them in program design and program implementation. And we had a very interesting discussion at that webinar, which really started to ask the question, should social protection be delivered through public works programs? If so, how? How do you mediate the different objectives? Or should social protection just be given in the form of cash transfers, which have a lower cost, lower admin needs? And in fact, that feeds really nicely in today's webinar, which looks at the question of, well, what are you actually creating through public works programs? Because the argument for doing public works is that you're creating assets, of course. So today we explore that whole question of what actually are the assets created through public works? What do we know about them? And then the final webinar, which is to be held in a month's time, same time at Thursday, the 3rd Thursday in the month, it's based on a World Bank paper which draws together learning on innovations in public works, looking at new programming which addresses some contemporary development challenges. So if you haven't already signed up for that one, please do. We'd love to see you at that one as well. And back to Eva. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anna, for this introduction to this really interesting series. And I can vouch that the first webinar was really interesting. And for those of you who have not been here, you can access it actually on the website of socialprotection.org. It has been recorded. But now let's move on to today's session. So today's session is based on a paper produced and written by ODI and partners, now published by SPARC, a program where ODI is also involved in, on sort of protracted crisis, agriculture, pastoralism across Africa and the Near East. And the paper we are presenting is really kind of asking the question whether public works programs create valuable assets for livelihoods and resilience for people who are involved in those programs, and of course beyond. The paper is based on a study conducted by ODI and partners a while ago already, looking at programs in Kenya and Ethiopia. This was a retrospective study to test primarily methodologies to assess impacts of public works program assets in the realm of natural resource management. The focus, though, today is very much on lessons learned about such public works programs with a livelihood asset focus, about design and implementation questions, and asks when and how to use public works programs to create livelihood assets and to build resilience of vulnerable people. But before we kind of go into the full presentations, a couple of words about today's session. First, the session is being recorded, and along with the presentations, it will be available on socialprotection.org, and you will also all receive a link to that after the session. Secondly, Zoom AI will generate automatic captions. You can access those by clicking on the CC, the closed caption button at the bottom of the page. Thirdly, there is a chat box function where you can present yourself, you can make comments, you can share useful links to other documents or insights you would like to share with the general audience. And finally, if you have questions to any of the speakers, please use the Q&A box. This Q&A box will be moderated as well. I will be drawing on those questions once we move towards the discussion. And if you have a very specific question to a specific speaker or panelist, please indicate this so that I know who to ask to answer that specific question. The session flow today is as follows. After this introduction of about 10 minutes, we will have two presentations lasting for about 30 minutes. And then we have discussions of about 20 minutes before we move into the question and answer session, where you can all kind of come in and pose your questions, unfortunately only in writing in the Q&A box and not in direct question to the panelists, but that will work as nicely as it does. But now let me quickly introduce you the round of participants today. We have two main speakers. These are Anna McCourt and Simon Levine. Anna McCourt is a senior research associate at ODI, working primarily on social protection policy and program design, impact appraisal and evaluation, with a specialization on public works programs. She has worked across Africa and Asia for major donors active in social protection, but also for national governments. Simon Levine specializes in livelihood and vulnerability analysis. Before joining ODI, now with the Global Risks and Resilience Program, he worked for many years for various NGOs, primarily across Africa. We have two really high-ranking discussions for which we are extremely grateful to. On the one hand, we have Amarjit Sinha, who is now the Principal Secretary of the Department of Social Welfare in the government of Bihar, and previously was the Secretary of the Ministry of Rural Development in India. He was very much involved in the NIGRA program, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, and has a ton of experience of public works programs and assets they create. The second discussant is Christo Marais. He is the, or was the Chief Director of the Natural Resource Management Program in the South African Department of Forests, Fisheries and the Environment, and at times overseeing programs that created employment opportunities for tens of thousands of workers per year, also in the field of natural resource management across South Africa. Without further ado, I think, and trying to stay on time, I would like to hand over now to our first presenter, Anna McCord. Over to you, Annie.
Thank you very much, Eva. I'd like to share my screen, so I think, Paula, if you could end the screen sharing, then I can share mine. Thank you. Eva, is that on the screen now? Great. So in this first presentation, I'm going to explore the methodological lessons from the study that Eva mentioned. The study was carried out by a multidisciplinary team. Simon was one of the co-authors, as was Eva herself. And we also had colleagues from Ethiopia and Kenya. The original research was designed and carried out by ODI multidisciplinary team and financed by DFAT. And this report was prepared under the SPARC program and financed by FCDO. So the purpose of this, let me just get rid of that's better, isn't it? The purpose of this presentation is to explore the PWP double promise. Now, what do we mean when we say the PWP double promise? Public works programs deliver both social protection, giving a wage transfer to enable participants to meet their immediate needs, but they also promise to deliver sustainable livelihoods benefits. Assets created through public works program offer future productive benefits, contributing to sustained improvement in livelihoods and resilience. And this is really why we have this popularity of public works programs, because they give the short-term benefit from the wage transfer, but also sustainable livelihoods benefits from the assets. And currently in the discourse, there's also a lot of discussion about the environmental and climate benefits, but that's not what we're looking at here. We're trying to explore this question of the sustainable livelihoods benefits. But actually, what we found as researchers before we started this work was that the evaluation focus on public works programs was very much on the immediate impact of the wage. There's very little research which actually looks at the livelihoods outcomes of these programs over time. There's a lack of rigorous evaluation of the impact of assets. And in fact, in the sector, there's a lot of what we call assumption-based programming, i.e. there's a kind of black box approach. The idea is that you create a public works asset and it will have livelihoods benefits. So this is a kind of representation of the black box of assumed impact of public works assets. We assume that you create a natural resource asset and there will be improved livelihoods at community and household level. But actually, there are some real methodological problems with the way that we evaluate these programs and the way we think about how we know about the impact. And the two most popular tools that are used to appraise the impact of public works programs are random control trials and focus group discussions. And if we look at randomized control trials, it's clear that there are major limitations to the use of quantitative survey approaches to appraise social protection impacts. And chief among these are the problem there's very rarely baseline data. There's a real challenge of finding adequate comparators which really do enable a fair comparison to be made. And also random control trials really focus on identifying correlations. The intervention happens, these are the livelihoods changes which are seen. It doesn't look at the relationship between the intervention and the impacts. And then focus group discussions are often used as the main qualitative approach to complement randomized controlled trials. And these are very much used to add color. We did a review of evaluations and found that the use of focus group discussions is really just to add a little bit of illustration to the findings from randomized control trials. And the findings from focus group discussions are usually reported without any kind of verification and seem to be primarily used to support project assumptions. So looking a little bit more at the methodological problems in conventional evaluation of public works assets, there's a real lack of integration between qualitative and quantitative approaches. And it's clear that qualitative approaches aren't perceived as robust as statistical approaches. They're very much seen as secondary and inferior. Also, there's a reliance on pre-identified indicators when we're looking for evidence of intended impacts. So we identify what we think the impacts are going to be rather than finding them. And this reflects the fact that we take a kind of confirmatory rather than exploratory approach in most public works evaluation. We want to confirm whether the impacts that we're looking for happened rather than explore to try and find out what the impacts might be. And there's a very heavy reliance on program assumptions for the interpretation of data rather than actually testing program assumptions. Furthermore, evaluations tend to use fixed designs rather than flexible designs. So if something interesting emerges or something that wasn't anticipated during the process of evaluation, the same methodology is used rather than adapting it and perhaps finding different approaches to explore emerging issues. Another methodological problem is that the existing methods don't really address positive respondent bias. And this is something we'll come back to. But perhaps one of the most fundamental ones is that when we're looking at the impact of public works assets, there's very rarely a review of impact sustainability over time. And there's much discussion about sustained livelihoods impact, but very few evaluations actually come back to look at the impact of public work assets over time. So what we did as a team was to try and develop an alternative approach to assessing the asset livelihoods impact of public works assets. We looked at the problems, we looked at all these issues that we identified above and thought, well, how can we address these? So we came up with an alternative approach, and that's what we really want to share with you this morning. The approach was based on creating a causal chain by which the intervention could have led to the positive change in livelihoods. We'll come back to that. We then tested each link in the chain between the intervention and the intended outcome. We used a mixed methods approach, using a variety of qualitative and quantitative approaches. And also we created a multidisciplinary team that involved soil scientists, agronomists, anthropologists, engineers, and economists, because we felt that actually it's only by looking at these different dimensions of the problem that we can hope to understand what the livelihoods impact might be. We tried to explicitly address positive respondent bias, and we tried also to ensure that the findings are plausible. That's something which is important, and you'll see as I present the findings. We also decided to triangulate all the findings that we had with independent corroborating evidence. So we didn't take one piece of evidence as being sufficient to say this was an impact. We sought to triangulate. And we tried to include in our evaluation an analysis of potential external drivers of change. So rather than excluding external factors, we tried to actively appraise them so that we could look at their impact. So essentially what we did was we designed a flexible approach which was exploratory rather than confirmatory, and that went back to look at assets about 5 years after they'd been implemented. So let me tell you a little bit more about the causal chain approach, because that's really at the heart of what we did. Some people call it process tracing. We took the theory of change for the program, for programs, to try and identify the program assumptions. And then we made those assumptions explicit in a causal chain model, which set out each link which would be necessary for the program to have an impact. And this causal chain model provided a framework for testing each link. And for each link, we thought, well, which tools and approaches would be most appropriate? And this enabled us to put together an approach which really integrated mixed methods and a multidisciplinary approach. So rather than this kind of black box correlation approach to evaluation, which characterizes randomized control trials, we used an approach which looked like this. This is what the causal chain looks like for looking at the potential impact of natural resource public works assets on livelihoods income outcomes. So here we have the creation of the public works labour, and here we have the livelihoods outcome. And we thought, well, what has to happen? So we identified these 4 causal links. The labour invested and the natural resource assets created have to actually result in a set of assets which function. That's the first question. Did it create assets that are functioning? The next link was saying, well, did those assets have an impact on the quality and availability of natural resources? Then, did that change in natural resources actually lead to a change in production? And did that change in production then lead to outcomes related to livelihoods at community level? So you can see, instead of just saying these assets were created, these outcomes were observed, we actually identified those links and tested each one. So this is really what you might call a theory-based approach to impact assessment. And in order to test out this new methodology, to see if it could actually give us insights into the impact of public works assets on livelihoods, we carried out a case study. And we looked at 2 public works programs creating natural resource assets which had livelihoods objectives. One in Kenya, which was looking essentially at the creation of ponds, and one in Ethiopia, which was looking at soil conservation. And we worked with as partners with the implementing agencies and asked them to put forward programs that they saw as being successes in terms of meeting these livelihoods objectives. So these were 2 programs that were identified as successes. And we used the causal chain approach for how the assets could have impacted on livelihoods for each. And what we did was we articulated the links the way I showed you for each program. Did the public works program create assets that are functioning? Did the assets improve the natural resources? Did the improvement in natural resources lead to improved productivity? And did the productivity lead to improved livelihoods? That's what we set out to test. So I can't go through all the methods that we used, but I just wanted to run briefly through the way that we looked at the issue and some of the innovations. And I think it's key to say these weren't expensive innovations. None of them in and of themselves are new ways of looking at program impact, but they hadn't been put together in this way to really assess public works assets. I'll just go through these briefly. We did a technical review of the assets created. Are they still existing 5 years later? And what's their technical quality? We did a survey, a quasi-randomized control trial. Interestingly, we didn't make the respondents aware of the asset focus. We purposefully sequenced the questions to avoid respondent bias. We did soil samples. We looked to explore the issues of erosion and soil fertility. We looked at the physical structure, nutrient content, percentage of organic matter. Another technical analysis was rainfall data analysis, so we could see what kind of external determinants of water availability might be and how that might also impact on crop yields. We did an analysis of the scientific literature to identify the scientifically plausible range of soil fertility impacts, so that we could see what the potential impact of the programme could be technically from a scientific perspective. We carried out interviews with local traders looking at trading volumes and content. We carried out land use mapping analysis to see if we could identify change of use. We introduced physical asset use monitoring over time for the ponds, so we could see how long did they have water in them, who used them, what did they use the water for, when and why. And we also did focus groups. But what we did was we introduced a blinded component to the focus groups. We did some in a conventional way, asking people what the impact of the assets was. But then at another time, we did simultaneously focus group discussions, which didn't mention the assets and asked about changes in production and water availability. So we used this range of different techniques to test each of those links. And I just Very briefly, I'm going to share with you the findings. The headline finding, the first one, is that in neither case, when we did the causal chain analysis, did the causal chain links show that public works assets led to sustained livelihood impacts. So these projects had been presented as successes, but when we actually tested the causal links, we could not find that there was any indication that the assets had actually led to sustained livelihoods impact. And the second finding, I think, is really interesting. There's significant evidence of pro-project bias. We really discovered this very starkly in this when we applied this methodology. I'll just give you two examples. In the soil conservation study, the focus group claims included that there had been a generalized increase in crop yields up to 300%. Now, that was said to us in the non-blinded focus group discussions, i.e. the focus group discussions where people knew that we were looking at the impact of the public works assets. Nothing like this was found in the focus group discussions, which were not focused on asset impact. There was no evidence of significant yield changes. That was not found. So on the one hand, you had the focus group discussion claiming up to 300% generalized increase in crop yields, but actually there was no evidence of significant yield changes. And there was no plausible way that the natural resource assets created could have caused a major change in production. Similar issue emerged in the pond study. The survey, in terms of the survey respondents, 71% reported that the public works pond had been beneficial or very beneficial in terms of its impact on livelihoods. But we designed the survey in such a way that this question came towards the end, and we'd already asked prior questions about which water sources people used, when, and for what purposes. And none of the 71% of people reporting that the public works asset had been very beneficial or beneficial had ever reported using the pond. So I think just these two highlights from our findings show the risk of depending on conventional methods and the risk of using a black box approach rather than actually interrogating each of the links and looking actually if the public works asset has created livelihoods benefits. So there's a lot more we could say. Please do read the paper if you're interested. But for now, I'll hand over to Simon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah, for that. And if I can just get this going, we will. So the question, hopefully you can see the slides, yeah. So the question is, okay, we went to a few public works programs. As Hannah has described, we didn't find significant sustained impact on livelihoods. But what can we actually conclude from that? Let's look a little bit in, not in great detail, a few of the factors involved in the problem with the assets, because they're going to be relevant later on. So in Ethiopia, we found that actually the structures largely worked. Check dams and this to control erosion. Structures were still there and working. But what? There were so many of them. People building check dams like every meter when, they would have absolutely no benefit whatsoever. People were building 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 times more structures than there was any logic. That's relevant. We'll come back to that in a moment. Less successful with trees. There was lots of reforestation going on. Very, very few trees had survived. That's relevant. We'll come back to that in a moment. And yeah, and as Anna said, when we looked, no change in soil quality at all, no change in water infiltration, no change in agricultural production. So we can say there were no livelihood impacts. With the proviso, we have to say, except for a very few individuals. And what this means is, where there was a huge gully going straight down into someone's field and, and washing half their field away, the erosion control was successful and did have an impact. But it had an impact on maybe one person in the village, 2 people in the village, that kind of thing. Kenya, the story was in some ways worse because the structures largely failed. Yeah, we could still find them, but as Anna said, we monitored the dams very closely over 2 different rainy seasons. We went back over 2 rainy seasons. After 4 weeks, most were dry. And as Anna said, we looked at the rainfall. This was after a year, season of very good rains. 4 weeks later, nearly all of them were dry. The ones that were there water was contaminated and so on. The technical challenges were known. We had our expert with us, Eva, moderating here, who was analysing. She could see very, very clearly why these dams could never have worked. Yeah, they were built in the wrong places, the topography was wrong, the soil they were built on was wrong, there was bound to be seepage. Hand compaction meant that the structures were never going to work. So, and all of these problems were already known. There were no functioning management committees, which is why the ponds were contaminated. That's relevant. We'll come back to that in a moment. For the few weeks after the rainy season, people had much better alternative water sources. And so, and as Anna said, when we did the survey, people were using those alternatives because they were better rather than these. Almost no one used the ponds. We can basically say no livelihood impacts. Okay, what can we conclude, if anything? Now, it's easy to say, well, hold on a minute. We didn't go around into this huge sample of worldwide public works programs assets. So we're obviously not going to try and conclude that public works assets are always a failure. Now, if anyone thinks that's what we're saying, I can reassure you that is not what we're saying. Can we conclude anything at all? I mean, maybe we were just unlucky. Maybe we just happened, even though we insisted from the implementing organizations, please only take us to successes. We were trying to develop methodologies for assessing impact. We needed there to be impact. Yeah, we did not want to go to places with no impact. Otherwise, we couldn't test our tools properly. Did we just get a little bit unlucky? Well, there are some reasons why the warning lights start to flash. The first is the fact that we were told that these were successful. Everyone was telling us, oh, yes, there was exports to Europe of honey as a result of the soil and water conservation in Ethiopia and so on. People were growing vegetables in Kenya as a result of the ponds. So lots and lots of stories. The people behind the implementers, names don't matter. We're not here to do finger pointing. But these are significant actors who are involved. They didn't know what was really going on. So at the very least, we can conclude that it is often true that no one's got a clue what's going on with the assets. That should be worrying. Anna has mentioned that it's more expensive to do public works than it is just to give people the wage without asking them to work. She didn't give you the figures, which are very, very roughly, as a good rule of thumb, it's twice as expensive to do public works. So roughly speaking, depends obviously on what you're building and where, etc., etc., etc. But roughly speaking, if you want to make people work for their money, they're only going to get half as much money as they would have got if they didn't have to work. Yeah. So the value of the assets has got to be at least as much as the value of the transfer for it to be worthwhile doing. And yet no one's got a clue what's going on. That should be worrying. Now, warning lights start to turn into alarm bells when you take a closer look at why the assets weren't performing. Yeah, because we started to see a pattern. The pattern was quite simple. At no stage in the project cycle had the assets ever been taken seriously. Yeah? Now, I can't go through all the failings and all the stages of the project cycle. The next couple of slides will give you a flavor of what it is that we mean when we say assets were not taken seriously at any stage of the project cycle. Okay, so if you look at the problem analysis, why are we doing this? The only thing discussed was the food security. People need either the food if it was food for work or the cash if it was cash for work, as the programs were being called. Yeah, there was no analysis which said, that if we had some soil conservation, this is the real problem for the agricultural needs. Or these people over here, they lack a water source at this time of the year. It's this constraint on their livestock production, whatever. Nothing. No theory of change explaining why the assets were going to lead to better livelihoods. It's a good job because pretty implausible. There really was no way. We were trying to discover what could a possible theory of change be, and there really wasn't anything that was plausible very often. An economic case, a value for money case, absolutely simply not done. And again, highly implausible. We tried to do one for one of the dams, which cost, this is something like $50,000 in today's money. And we worked out, back of the envelope calculation, if there was no seepage at all, and miraculously no evaporation, no water losses, nothing, every single drop of water from a full dam that never, ever silted up could be used for vegetable growing, it would give about 3 people the opportunity to grow some vegetables for a few months. Yeah, for a cost of, so where's the value for money case? Not done. If you look at the site selection, why were the dams put where they were put? Because that's where people were hungry and needed a wage. But the dams never could have worked there for reasons that I've already kind of alluded to. If you look at the time in Ethiopia, why did the trees all die? It's quite simple. The trees were planted when people needed to be made to work, which was just after at the end of the rainy season. Anybody who's planted a tree knows that you plant a tree at the beginning of the rainy season, then it might survive. But that's not when people needed to be given work, so that's not what happened. We can carry on. The budget. There was no budget where you said how much money is needed for a good dam, how much money is needed. No, not at all. The question was, how much money do we need to give people? And then let's just see, let's make them work. The design implementation is all around. Why was I referred previously to so many structures being created that had no purpose whatsoever? That's not true. They did have a purpose. It wasn't a soil conservation purpose. It was making people work. It was absorbing labor. That's why the dams weren't compacted properly. It needed some mechanical compaction as well as the labor. That wasn't done. No, let's use more labor because that's what we are here for, not to build a good dam. I said, why was there no management? This is a good one, actually. Why was there no management of the dams? Because bizarrely, the management committees were created. Who was on the management committee? The food for work beneficiaries, the people who were hungry and had been made, not people who lived close to the dam, not people who ever used the water in the ponds, but the food for work beneficiaries. That, for us, was a perfect example of how the dam, the pond, was never of any interest to anyone. It was purely about the works. Yeah. And then, and Anna's already alluded to this with evaluations. If you look at the monitoring information, if you look at the evaluation impact, they've not looked at assets at all. Now, it is possible. We're all human. We all make mistakes. We all forget things. We're busy. We've got too much on our minds. It's very easy at one or two of these stages to, just to kind of, my monitoring, I didn't have anything on the assets. Yeah, it's possible. Is it plausible to think that at every single stage in the project cycle, assets are just not there? Alarm bells ringing. The alarm bells really start to get a little bit deafening when you start to look at the politics of what's going on. Yeah? Because we were given success stories about the assets. Yeah? It's not that people didn't care about the assets. People cared to talk about the assets and to present them as successes. And I'm sure all of you have read, you've seen the stories. It's always kind of the smiling picture, often a woman, not always. And her children are now going to school. And before she was hungry because now, and she'd probably be holding a big basket of plump ripe tomatoes that she's selling in the market. And all of that happened because of some project somewhere. Yeah, we've all seen those stories and they're presented as typical. Yeah. Now, you could just plausibly say that one or two people who live next to a gully now had that kind of success. Yeah. But we know just the description of the problem already tells you that's going to be one person. It's certainly not typical. More than that, they're implausible to anybody who understands anything about the assets. A 300% increase in yield because someone has built some contours. I mean, come on, guys. Anyone who knows anything about agriculture knows that this is bonkers. It's just never going to happen. Yeah. And if you're not sure, we were able to debunk this with about a 10-minute conversation with a trader by saying, so, are you selling an awful lot more food out of that village now? And he goes, no, God, no. For the last 10 years, I've been bringing more and more food in. I'm paraphrasing. This is a genuine conversation. Yeah. So it takes about 10 minutes to find out that no, food production in that village has not gone up by 300 times. Per capita, it's probably going down. Yeah. So if all of this is going on, is it possible to conclude anything? It's certainly possible to conclude that the alarm bells are deafening. And the question then is, and I leave this question with you to answer, because basically, if people are putting out stories which are easily debunked, highly implausible to someone who understands what they're talking about, either agencies are even ignoring competency when it comes to selecting the staff, and the staff don't realize that this is implausible. Well, that's not been my experience of agency staff. Or worse, because the alternative is that they know full well, it's disingenuous, they know full well that these are not honest and typical stories, but stories are being put out because they want to sell a model. I will leave each of you to determine for yourselves what you think of the morality of putting out stories which are not true in order to provide a fake evidence base for a modality that is costing millions and millions and millions of dollars, which could be given to people who need the money, but instead is being spent on assets that don't work. So can we conclude anything at all about the sample? Well, we don't know whether or not there are some assets out there which are delivering. I mean, presumably there are, because we didn't look at that many projects. But we do know that some of the actors, at least the ones that we were dealing with, they don't know either. We do know that the systems aren't in place, again, among some of the public works actors. I'm really looking forward, by the way, to hearing the moderators. I have no idea what they're going to say. They're two people who've got huge experience in very, very different countries. And I'm really fascinated to know whether they see different things or whether whether they have better systems in place. But what we saw, large actors in the sector, they just don't have systems in place for knowing whether their assets deliver. Worse than that, they don't have systems in place for giving the assets any chance, because at no stage in the project cycle is anyone saying, hold on a minute, are we monitoring this? Hold on a minute, is there a business case for that? Hold on a minute, what's your theory of change for doing that? Nothing at all. And we do know that there's a strong culture that prioritizes selling the product over learning the truth. And I gave one of the justifications. I mean, as we say, making people work for the money basically means you're giving people half the money that you've got for social assistance, and the other half is going on making them work. So, and there were two justifications for cutting, if you like, cutting the transfer in half. One is, that's commonly heard, is because the half that they're not getting, they'll get benefits from that, from the assets. But we've seen that actually no one takes that very seriously. Well, not no one. In the study that we did, no one. The other justification, which you actually do still sometimes hear, I mean, you used to hear it in my country in the days of the workhouse and in the days of the Great Famine in Ireland, which was, God, you can't feed people for free. That would be immoral. It would make them indolent. There is a moral case for saying people have got to work in order to be given a handout. You do sometimes hear that from governments around the world. Is that really, surely that can be what's going on? But, you know, so I'm struggling here on this one. So how will we know? I'm kind of coming here and I'm saying, you know what? I don't think anybody cares about the assets. Surely I cannot be right. Well, okay, we'll find out. Because certainly, I mean, as I say, our findings aren't universal. We've only looked at a couple, and there must be lots of great programming around the world. If I were in charge of a public works agency and someone said, Simon, go to this webinar, and I've just sat through this presentation, am I going to go back to the office and close down my program and go, shit, public works programming doesn't work? No, of course I'm not going to. Yeah, but what would I do? Well, the first thing I would do is I call in my meal person and say, can you tell me, are we checking the assets in our monitoring and evaluation? Yeah, I want to know. Yeah, and if they say, yeah, of course we are, I go, thanks very much, because I heard this webinar and someone said that not everyone is doing, but we are, all good. I'd be calling in my head of programs or whatever you call them in your organization to say, can you let's go through some of these documents, program documents. Can we check? Have we got a good theory of change on why the asset might work? Yeah. Have we done any kind of a business case, a value for money case? I'd be checking, yeah, because I wouldn't be assuming that we had the same problem, but I would just want to make sure that we're not falling into the same problem. I probably want to look at some of our stuff, you know, what are we putting out online? Am I comfortable with the kind of stories that we're putting out? And finally, it's never too late to learn. I'd probably be sort of, you know, maybe contacting my donors and saying, you know what, can we put together something where somebody goes back sort of to some of the stuff that we did 4 or 5 years ago to see whether really, you know, it is working or not. Now, I have to say that our experience when we first shared these findings immediately after the research, this is not the response that we got, I can say, from everybody. I won't go into more detail than that right now. But I'm hopeful. You've got to be hopeful in life. So we will know, do public work actors actually care about the assets? Yeah, we'll find out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna and Simon, for these excellent presentations, both on the methodology questions, how could one check whether such assets really create livelihood benefits over the longer term, but then also some of the more political economy thinking behind why and how are these assets actually working or not. A really fascinating presentation of that study, which, as Simon alluded, at times was also somewhat controversially looked at. And you will have the link to the full report in the chat where you can access it, and it will also be on the website later. But now, kind of moving on swiftly, as we are a little bit over time already, I would like to go into some of the issues the study has thrown up in relation to the assets of public works programs. And that is both in terms of the methodology, how to assess, but also the more broader public sort of political economy questions around those. And both of these areas we would like our discussants to reflect on. So the first question, actually, we would like both Amarjit and Christo to answer briefly in about 5 minutes each, is the following. And this is the evaluation challenge. could you reflect on what Anna presented and share your own experiences having struggled with similar issues, and what guidance can you offer for these kind of future evaluation practices so that we can better understand the quality of assets and their contribution to people's livelihoods? Amarjit Singh, I would like you to share your reflections first. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Anna and Simon, for a very absorbing presentation. Across the world, wherever public welfare programs, public workfare programs, public employment programs, call them by whatever name, similar issues are flagged. The tension between social protection, which is just give a wage, give some incomes, and the other that it should be a livelihood security, an asset creation, a durable asset that improves your incomes in subsequent years. This tension is there in all such programs. How does one resolve it? Let me take the example of perhaps the largest public employment program in the world, which India has been managing now for the last about 20 years, 2 decades, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. That too is faced with this challenge of creating employment and creating assets that actually contribute to sustainable livelihoods. And in doing so, the evaluations, the assessments, the studies from time to time, the first lesson very clearly is that there is nothing called a data. However much you make it real time, however much you make geotagging, however much you use data used for digital public infrastructure, there is no alternative to triangulation. We will have to arrive at the truth through a series of processes. The second lesson, again, generally public works programs are seen as community assets. They are seen as programs on community land, large ponds, and so on. If you visualize natural resource management as a complete treatment ridge to valley, then you'll view it a little differently. Then private lands, and again in India, as all of you would be knowing, more than 85% of the landholding community are marginal and small farmers, having very small holdings. It's not a country with very huge holdings. That being the case, under the program of public work, what we do under MGNREGS, we shifted our focus to individual assets which go to individuals, an irrigation well, a farm pond in one corner of the land, which helps in protective irrigation, land development, which makes rain-fed areas also become active, construction of animal sheds, poultry shed, a goatery shed, a dairy shed, and so on, and the milch cattle or the kid for goatery being provided as an asset or the resource for the family. I'm giving these examples because what we find, where we have had a large number of studies, I mean, MGNREGA must be one of the most studied programs. Yes, there have been failures. Yes, there have been challenges. But ultimately, the solutions finally that started emerging came from one, expanding the focus to a comprehensive, scientific, technologically foolproof ridge to valley treatment. In the case of Rajasthan, one of our provinces, a very specific call was taken that we will do a comprehensive drought proofing. Whatever it, don't go by the resource available, go by the need, the environmental need for drought proofing. Once we followed that approach, it yielded different results. MGNREGS was only one of the resources. Lot other resources were also pooled in. But when you don't follow that approach, especially with a standalone pond or with a standalone structure, the problem is unless and until we have treated ridge to valley comprehensively, it is likely that we will have very, very soon silt formation, topsoil erosions much faster than we assume. The other points that have been mentioned, and that is important because what happens is when you have large-scale public works programs, and suppose your wage rates are a little lower than market wages, then what often happens is that it is the old people, people in poor health, very old persons, they are the ones who come to these programs in search of work more than others. Poorer people, because while many countries follow targeting, in the case of MGNREGS, we have followed a principle of self-targeting, that only somebody will take physical work or unskilled work who is in need of it. Nobody else would do it because it is an arduous work. So having said that, what our experience tells us that the use of technology as a means at every stage, from payments to measurements to geotagged images of the asset created. We got a national evaluation done in 2018 of a large number of natural resource management programs by our National Institute of Economic Growth, Dr. Manoj Panda and the team. And they did find that the assets exist and that most of them were very productive. But again, as I said, that was at a time when we had already shifted our emphasis to individual beneficiary schemes as well. The returns on investments in individual beneficiary schemes appears to have been a little better. The Economic and Political Weekly published an article by Dr. Ashok Pankaj, who studied 3 states with regard to individual beneficiary schemes. And he did find that in many cases, marginal and small farmers who were the beneficiaries of these programs made full use of the resources that were available to them. The third effort which was made, which also gave good results, India decided to go for a very large and ambitious housing for all program, under which we wanted to provide a good structure for every person. In that program, every beneficiary got 90 days of work, which added to poor people getting work directly for a productive asset, for an asset that gave safety to the household. I've been.
Amajit, thank
Yeah.
you very much. I'm sorry to have to interrupt you here. We could all kind of listen much more to such rich experiences with that program and learn a lot of lessons. But let's quickly move on also to invite Christo and kind of provide your insights of the programs you were leading in South Africa. Over to you, Christo.
Thank you very much, Eva. I'm going to try and be quite quick. Firstly, my review looked at using livelihoods, in situ livelihoods, as an indicator of success of public works programs or nature-based public works programs. And my review will look at how can we improve the assessment of public works programs, because I don't think in situ livelihoods is necessarily the silver bullet to measure PWPs. The projects were not designed to ensure the production of quality assets. This has come through right in the text in the report and the presentations. Now, that very often happens in public works programs. Like we all know, the primary objective of public works programs are people are employed to employ. And this is often a mistake made by public works programs. A proof of concept public works programs where the monitoring and evaluation is priority 1 will be a good idea to develop guidance on best practice. Then my second comment comes back to the issue of using livelihoods. I would like to see, if it's nature-based EPW programs, ecosystem-based programs, then I think one should look at the suite of across the spectrum of ecosystem services, from provisioning services, which is effectively livelihoods, cultural services, which is educational and in some cases recreation, etc., etc. And then the regulatory service, or the regulating services. Once we start adding up all those benefits, the the outcomes of the cost or the return on investment of public works programs start to look a bit differently. That, Simon, doesn't negate your findings of work not being followed up, or not being, maintenance not being done. Ecological restoration, and I must be honest, I've looked at the Kenya dam or pond model from the perspective of that's the way you would deal with wetlands kind of thing in the field that I worked in. But ecological restoration is, there's one thing that people tend to forget. They see it as a once-off investment, and it's not a once-off investment. You've got your capital investment in the beginning when you build a pond, or when you restore the wetland, or where you revegetate areas. There's an initial capital investment. Then there's follow-up investments to maintain, or not to maintain that infrastructure. I call it ecological infrastructure, but to improve and to the failures, to address those failures in your follow-up program. And once you've got to a maintenance value or maintenance stage, things should start costing less and be worth more, but it still needs to be maintained. I've made a note here about the carbon sequestration and the water benefits, so I'm not going to go into that much. I just want to mention in the Ethiopia project, there's figure 2 has got a hill without trees and a hill with trees. I sincerely hope that hill with trees is not Australian acacias. I visited an investment in watershed services field trip once to Ethiopia, and they were planting trees to stabilize catchments. There is a problem with planting trees in places where it shouldn't be planted. Some areas must be grasslands. And I'm not sure exactly what the situation in the Ethiopian case is, but appropriate vegetation needs to be established where, based on an expected outcome of what it was. Much of Africa is grasslands and savannas. It's fire prone. Those kind of things need to be considered. Then something that I do think that will add, and this is a challenge that we've had as well, but for the last 4 or 5 years that I've been working with NGOs and other entities, the use of remote sensing to measure or to quantify the impacts of your programs. There's some fantastic remote sensing technology that one can use to measure a broader scope of benefits, and to see how those benefits are playing itself out, are impacting. The other one that I just wanted to touch on, I'm nearly finished, Eva. The one that I wanted to touch on is when it comes to the restoration of catchments, of watersheds and so forth, especially in the grasslands. The key, all rangelands ecologists will tell you that the key to the restoration and maintenance of your natural resource, your grazing, is rest. So the public works programs need to consider a training program that will go into the sustainable management of that resource afterwards. the Ethiopia project looked at only the hilltops, but the areas below will need to change as well in their approach, and that's why the benefits don't follow through. And the silting up of the dams, Simon, you mentioned that it doesn't help you build a dam in a degraded landscape. It's going to silt up, so you need to restore your catchments as well. And maybe the public works programs need to focus on the restorations of the catchments first, and then start building dams. And my last comment, because the project cycle in Kenya focused on the short-term food security objectives, okay, I've addressed this as well. One does need to not just look at the outputs or the number of jobs created or a dam created, but the outcomes and the impacts as well. And Simon, both yourself and Anna has alluded to this in terms of the value of the assets that's being created. And those assets need to be maintained, whether it's a pond or whether it's a wetland or whether it's a riparian zone or a catchment. There's always a need for maintenance when people are involved. And I'm going to stop here for this part of the review. Thanks, Eva.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Christo. Really great point. And just to kind of take that out a little bit of context, that image of those two hills, the green hill was actually an area that was just closed off. So there was no investment happening. It was just an area that was no longer grazed for a while. It's just a bit outside of the area where we were looking at the public works programs. But one can rehabilitate hillsides like that by just not grazing them for a couple of years. Natural vegetation comes back, and that would be local vegetation. And you alluded also to the problem of what kind of trees are planted. Are they really the ones that fit into a specific agroecology? Mostly they do, not always, but there has been also a big change, of course, over the last 10 years since we did the field work for that studies. But anyway, let me move on. I think there were some really superb observations in here, how to better assess, including looking at a broader suite of benefits, not just the production side of assets, but also the kind of the provisioning and all the other ecosystem services, really important. We looked at some of them, for example, whether assets provided more stable water flows in wells. In some cases, yes, in other cases, no. So again, very much also context dependent. But without going into detail from my side, I think we should move on to the second question that is still out there. And if I might really kind of kindly ask both of the discussants to be really brief on that one. And that is now more on the tensions, and you have already somehow alluded to it, between that kind of issue of providing quality assets versus generating work days. And you have indicated some ways of doing that, but if you could kind of also, in terms of the more now policy side, kind of share your experiences, how you would recommend working and resolving that tension between creating sustainable assets that really create livelihood benefits over the long term, and public works programs which have to address kind of livelihood or wage shortages for people in the short term. So again, Amarjeet, if you could share your insights with that in terms of policy design and implementation, also for national and international actors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No, thank you for alluding to the tension between social protection and sustainable development, between durable assets and work generation. I had the privilege of being the chairperson of a committee which looked at this in the context of employment programs in India. And among other recommendations, and many of them have global implications in the sense that they probably hold true for most countries. One is that public works cannot be seen as an ad hoc measure. It's not a seasonal or an ad hoc measure. It has to be seen as a comprehensive program of asset creation. And that in that process of asset creation and value generation, it has to be scientifically thought through. It is not that you can create employment the day it is required, unless it is thought through very carefully and comprehensively, where you follow a ridge to valley principle, where for other things also, you follow the appraisal process, whether or not it will deliver what is expected. The second is explore the individual beneficiaries across countries in programs. When you are improving your own asset, your own land, the ownership is much more rather than a community land. While we need to do work on community land for sure, the fodder requirement, so many things, public lands need to be reclaimed. But along with it, if you also use this resource for poor households with very little land, but where your resources, either for an animal shed or for an irrigation well or for protective irrigation or for small plantations in the backyard, all this can add up in terms of sustainability, in terms of wealth creation, in terms of transforming lives and livelihoods. The third thing which strikes me is that comprehensively a public works program must have a material component as well. You don't have to just create wage employment. That wage employment quality is also determined by the material component that you assign to it. So there's nothing wrong in having a building for, say, nutrition, a building for small infants for their creche as part of these programs. So recognize the need for material as well. The fourth factor, which is very important, yes, this is the permanent employment opportunities will come with economic expansion and growth. Having said that, while there is some eminent sense in saying that wages in public works program, if they're a little lower than market wages, then it works better because it also improves in improving the market wages. In a manner, it lays down the floor, which is also serving a purpose. So wages need to be tweaked in such a manner that it is not very low. If it is very low, then getting full productivity out of that wage is not a very easy task, and that often reduces the efficacy of such programs. And the last thing that I wish to say, community action, decentralized community action is the way forward. More than anything else, what makes the difference at the cutting edge is the extent to which social capital has been invested in. It could be a homogeneous group like a women's collectives. It could be local leaders. But unless and until decentralized community action is very central to the whole process of public works program, neither transparency nor accountability is possible on scale. It has to be people-centric. It has to be scientifically thought through. It has to be responsive to needs at the local level. And most importantly, it has to have ownership of communities who really need it most and who can make the best of it. I think there are possibilities of working on these elements comprehensively. And wherever in many of the provinces in my country where it was tried out, many of these principles have worked quite well. Yes, there can be a focus on areas which need natural resource management more than others. There are these dark areas in every country where the water table is in a bad shape. Can we focus on those regions on a priority with a comprehensive 3 to 5 year plan to move forward? I can see Eva pointing out the 5
My
fingers.
hand is coming
I
up.
stop here. Thank you.
Apologies for
Not at
cutting
all.
you
Not at all.
short.
Thank you.
Again, excellent input. I really, really appreciate those. Also, this tension between public land and individual land, and of course, all the public works programs we were looking at in this study were happening on public lands, and there were very little investments in parallel happening on the private land, because it was kind of clear private landowners should do that themselves. So this was all public land investments. So thanks a lot again, Amarjit, for your input, and again over to you, Christo. We would very much like to hear your view as well, how you would reconcile such kind of tensions, or how you would reconcile those two goals, more in the policy and design of public works programs.
Thank you, Eva. I fully agree with Amarjit's last comment about community involvement, and I've already touched on. I think that the whole approach to the broader ecosystem services approach is a policy issue as well, and I will come to why it's a policy issue as well. I firmly believe the question has been raised by the presenters about killing these two birds with one stone. It can be killed with one stone. And we must remember, and I think Amarjit has also referred to that money over and above the wages is also creating jobs. It's also creating economic activity. And it's an employment multiplier. And that needs to be considered as well. The benefits of the assets need to be studied. That's true, and I've already referred to the issue of initial restoration of or creation of the assets, follow up, and then maintaining once it's being fully produced in 3 or 4 years' time. I don't think I'm going to expand on what is already being said, especially by Simon, with regards to the need for monitoring and evaluation. Incidentally, that's been in the days that I was involved with the big programs. That was one of our big challenges. The one major policy issue that I would like to stress, we often, and it's a concept that was developed in Zimbabwe, community-based natural resource management. And many of these dams are being put in for community-based natural resource management. But community-based, if you look at the words, community-based natural resource management, if we turn that around and turn CBNRM into natural resource-based community or economic development, then the ball game of the public works program changes. At first, look at what is the natural resource base that we're talking about. How big is it? How much can it sustain, etc., etc. Can these dams work? And then you start developing the PWP. The next point I wanted to make comes out of the technical report, the accountability function. Accountability becomes so important that the value for money falls off the table in public works programs, and it's killing public works programs. The focus I'm not saying people shouldn't be accountable, but there should also be value for money in terms of ecosystem services and so forth. The incentives dimension, as part of the last part of your report, it's difficult. There must be incentives, and it's something that we simply have to deal with in our policies. The technical dimensions I've mentioned, I do think that there's an opportunity to start using remote sensing in the assessment of public works programs. The cultural dimensions, so often programs are being run down or are being criticized in reports, and nothing good is being said by them. And so people start holding back information, project proponents. And what we need to do is we need to develop frameworks And there's Professor Dolf de Groot and his team at Wageningen University a few years ago developed a framework for project assessment. This can be applied to PWPs as well, so that all the benefits and the shortcomings of the program is being assessed. That's so important. And then my last comment, the multidisciplinary approach. You've already had a multidisciplinary approach, but I would like to see in policy that there's a again, I'm coming back to, and maybe it's just because that's the field that I come from, the ecosystem services framework, being your provisioning services, your cultural services, and your regulating services. Assess all of those and then start saying whether the public works program is successful and whether they should be funded. That value proposition. We did some work on a value proposition for biodiversity stewardship a year or so ago. And that's so important for the public works programs. As Simon has said, in South Africa, a few billion rand has already been spent on the environmental programs, hundreds of millions of US dollars. So it's important to have a broad spectrum of costs and benefits to be considered in public works programs. That doesn't say, though, that we should ignore some of the findings or all of the findings that Simon and Anna has highlighted. That's the problem there. To some extent is a lack of monitoring and evaluation. And again, I don't know if I've mentioned it before, monitoring and evaluation in itself can create jobs. So I think we need to develop public works programs with a monitoring and evaluation component as part of the job creation component. That's it. Thank you very much, Eva.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Christo. Yeah, really great observations. And again, I think moving beyond, yes, that direct production focus to something much broader, kind of looking at other ecosystem services. And I very much also like your point about the monitoring of these programs also after the program kind of has ended. Now I'm struggling a little bit because looking at all the different questions that are in the chat, the majority is actually relating directly to the study. There are questions on methodology, why only 2 case studies, can you draw lessons from 2 case studies, etc. But there is one question I think I would like to quickly put back to Amarjit and Christo very briefly before we come to final words from Anna and Simon, is if there is this tension between creating assets that are sustainable and at the same time provide wages, and we know that public works programs are much more expensive than cash transfer programs, for example. Why is there still such a big focus on similar projects, very often projectized, quite short, not really focusing on longer-term sustainability, not really building in mechanisms to ensure maintenance of the assets once they are built because the project has terminated and agencies are moving on? Why, if we know all these kind of things are not really working as we thought, or we are focusing still on communal land rather than on individual land, but why is this persistent of similar kind of projects focusing on public lands, projectized short-term inputs with a focus on wages rather than a focus on assets? Why? What would you kind of conclude? Amarjit, very briefly.
Yeah, I think clarity of policy is a requirement. We cannot mix a dole and a livelihood security asset. I think the mistake that we do, we use the wrong instrument to do something different. This is not a dole. Any public works program, the first thing which it is not is a dole. It's not a social protection pension. You're expected to work and through that work create an asset which creates livelihood security. It is meant for able-bodied persons. So I think this clarity requires a comprehensive community perspective spread across 5 years with all the scientific and technological principles, with all the use of remote sensing for accountability and for planning for both, because there's a lot of work around environment, climate action, which actually can engage with science and technology and its new forms far better. Because I think this is a requirement of over a large part of the world. The degraded lands is a challenge everywhere. And if that is the case, because what is also clear, longer term reduction in poverty, agriculture plays a very important role. And we cannot deny that. While other forms of manufacturing, services, tourism, other sectors can come in. But on a large scale transformation in the early stages, agriculture plays a very important role. And if that is the case, then it's important that natural resource management continues to remain a focus. But clarity of policy is very, very necessary, where you comprehensively look at outcomes and transformation rather than just as an input of creating wage employment. And the last point I wish to make, cash transfers, many people, of course, say that why have a public works program, why not do cash transfer and close the matter? The issue is that there is a lot of infrastructure deficits in many developing countries. And if I have an infrastructure deficit, should I use for just doles of cash transfer, or should I use for creating useful assets which improve the likelihood of higher levels of economic activity in the future? I think it's a question I'd like to pose. So therefore, developing countries, how much they assign to cash transfers is something that I would raise as an issue, because it compromises their ability to spend on infrastructure, to remove those deficits of infrastructure, social infrastructure, rural infrastructure, all the forms of infrastructure, whether it is school buildings, whether it is colleges, whether it is hospitals. They are important. And if I have to do them, can more public works program, because at least in the public goods sector, health, primary education, we do need to make those investments. Can we visualize public works as contributing towards better outcomes in the public goods sectors in many of the developing countries? That's a challenge. If we do that, they can also become higher order economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good points. Christo, over to you. That same question, very briefly.
Yeah. I'm going to be a bit less philosophical than Amarjit. First one is political terms, administration terms, elections. In a country, and I can only speak from my experience in South Africa, if you've got a 33% unemployment rate in a country, your focus is employment, and more employment. But saying that, incidentally, I've done a bit of a read through State of the Nation addresses all the years since the start of the Working for Water program in 1995. And Working for Water were mentioned in 3/4, if not more of them, until the early 2000s. And the programs were always mentioned within the context of employment creation, not within the context of the disaster risk management that Working on Fire did, the contribution of Working for Waters to water security. And that is my solution to your question. How can we get away from these programmatic or not program? A program is a long-term thing. Project approaches. I think the public works programs managers or people responsible for PWPs must mainstream their programs within their mainstream activities. Environmental affairs should mainstream it into their conservation matters. Disaster risk management, like in South Africa, invasive alien plants often pose a very big fire management risk. By mainstreaming natural resource management, public works programs into mainstream deliverables, water, agriculture, disaster risk, tourism, you can minimize those project orientated, but it will always stay a challenge. That's, I'm afraid, it's and you have to manage it.
Thank you very much, Christo. Really great points. Now, before coming to an end, we've got very few minutes left. Anna, a few words in closure before Simon, a few words as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Eva, for this. I think there's been a really rich back and forth in the question and answer session. If you haven't looked at that, I'd invite you to look at it. Simon, I can't answer all the questions, but I'd just like to reflect very briefly. A couple of points. One, I totally agree with Christo. If we're looking to the future, I think there is a role for public works. A lot of people have said, well, why even have public works, not just cash transfers? In the future, we know we're going to have massive labour market and livelihoods disruption due to climate change. We're going to need ways to protect people's income security. At the same time, we're going to need significant investment in assets, in ecosystems, renovation, these kinds of things. So I think the key issue is to bring the two together in the way Christo is saying. And in that way, we could address this whole technical problem, because we have the ministry responsible for social protection, providing the labour, and then we have well-specified technical programs which are adequately monitored, which come from the relative sectoral ministries, the Ministry of Water in India. I know there's collaboration there with NREGA, ministries of the environment. So I think the thing is to think about how we can bring public works into those sectors so that we can be doing quality programs. And I think the other point is that we need to be asking what the impact is. We need to be checking that we're delivering quality assets. And that's really the key message. And I hope we've shared with you some innovative ways that you might go about checking. And I think it's an open invitation. We can't generalize from the two small studies we looked at, but we can say the ones we looked at, we didn't get the results we needed, and we need to use more innovative techniques to find out what we actually are achieving through these programs. Only once we've done that can we start improving them. Simon.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Simon.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I hope no one thinks that we're arguing that infrastructure shouldn't be built, and that people and that jobs can't be created by building infrastructure. The argument is, if you're building infrastructure, then think about the infrastructure. Christo said he thinks that it might be possible to kill two birds with one stone. You certainly can't kill two birds with one stone if you throw stones blind. You've got to target your stones very, very well, and you've also got to plan. You've got to wait until the two birds are in alignment, and that's whatever. So if you've got a plan to say, right, we need to build schools, how can we do it in the most labor-intensive way to create jobs? How can I use that as an apprenticeship scheme so that I'm taking on unemployed people and I'm teaching them to be, etc., etc., etc.? Fantastic. Then you are managing your project for your objectives, which might be skills training, it might be employability, it might be, maximizing labor, whatever it is. That's what we're saying. Christo, you also use the word, I don't use the word trade-offs, but you talked about whatever. You basically talked about trade-offs without using the term. It's always a trade-off. You've got to manage it, and you can't manage it if you don't acknowledge it. And that's what we're saying is there is a tension between the asset on the one hand, maximizing the labor. Don't hide that fact. If you hide the fact, you can't manage it. Accept it, because life is a trade-off. There's no such thing as killing 500 birds with no stones. Whatever. How am I going to do it? What's the best way? Couple of words that were really, really strong. I think, and Amanjit and Christo, you both used the words, I think, accountability, decentralization, community, these kind of words. And that basically isn't about the technicalities of the design. It's not about remote sensing for managing at all. Whatever. It's political. It's about saying, I need to think about these programs in a very different way. The power needs to change. They can't be so top down. I can't be running the programs for my own benefit because it's an easy way of spending money and I get great reports out of them. The accountability has got to be to the people who are affected by the assets. And that's not technical, it's not difficult, technically, it's hugely difficult politically. It's hugely difficult psychologically for people who have power. And we have to stop the defensiveness. Really interesting how the moment you criticize a program, people start complaining about your sample size. No one complains about your sample size when you say nice things. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Simon, for those closing words. Again, kind of also here the political economy of a lot of these discussions. Anyway, we need to kind of come to a close. There would be a lot to discuss, a lot of questions that were raised about the study, the methodology, the approach, etc., which we could go on and on, but we need to come to an end. Thank you very much, Christo and Amarjeet, for your contributions, for your critical engagement with what Anna and Simon presented from our study, which was done, data was collected more than some years ago, 10 years or something like that, published now, but I think the findings are still highly relevant and to walk to where we are and what we still are grappling with. So thank you very, very much, everyone. And with that, I think I'm handing back over to Paula, who will close this session and also make a kind of a comment in terms of the upcoming webinar, the third one within this series. Thank you very much, and over to you, Paula.
Eva, I think Paula will just be closing the webinar. So I think at this point, we'd just like to thank everyone for participating and say goodbye.
In that case, please do join us on the 26th of June if you can, where we move to innovations in social protection programs to address the 21st century development challenges. So thank you very much for being here, for having joined us. Goodbye, and come back onto the socialprotection.org website to see the presentations, the publication, and also some of the discussions. Thank you very much, and goodbye.